Welcome to the Runs Well podcast with me, Rick Pearson.
And me, Jane Maguire.
Today we're talking about how to train like a Norwegian. Jane, have you been training like a Norwegian, or are you still following the Joy plan, or maybe both?
Maybe both. No, definitely not the Norwegian plan. I'm still doing the Joy plan a bit. Still doing the Joy plan. Still working out, where that's going to take me. But still enjoying it. Still kind of trying to do a tempo session and a long run every week, and then what happens in between is whatever I feel like. So the Joy plan's got a little bit more structure, but definitely not Norwegian yet. What about you? Are you 100-mile weeks yet?
Not yet, no. I like the idea of I think in the Joy plan it would be the tempo would be the one that survives out of the hard sessions, wouldn't it? I don't think hills aren't getting into most Joy plans. I think interval sessions can be a bit of a hard sell, but I feel like a tempo run. Always feel like I'm more likely to do that if I'm kind of.
Hills have never ever been in my plan. I'm not. We've spoken about this before, haven't we? I will go out of my way to avoid hills, but tempo can stay. I do quite like a track session, but I think you have to be in the mood, don't you? That's really dependent on the weather. I think sunny day.
Yeah, you need some. I think you need some people, don't you? I've got huge admiration for people who can go to track on their own and put in a really honest effort. But I'm definitely not one of them. I need some people to run with. And some structure for it to happen. I was watching a bit of Wimbledon tennis because obviously that's on at the minute, and the one surviving Brit is this guy Cameron Norrie, who he's actually a really good runner as well. And they made a big thing of it. They were like, he went away and got himself really fit, which seems to be the only way to compete as a tennis player now. If you think of how fit Andy Murray was and stuff. But yeah, he said he went back to New Zealand, which is where he spent sort of a lot of his childhood during lockdown. And he posted a 36:45 10k and a 17:25k. And he says, I don't know if I'm better at 5 or 10, but I've got some good genes. My mum is a good runner. So yeah, pretty decent as a sort of non-runner. Pretty decent.
Yeah,
because he's obviously quite a big bloke as well as a tennis player. He's well over 6 foot, so it's quite all right, fair play.
Well,
there you go.
I hope he does well this week. I'll be watching now.
Yeah, I think if it doesn't work out, it could go and try and win the local park run. I reckon. Well, it is an interesting subject this week, isn't it? Because we've got the Norwegian training method, which seems a bit arbitrary for some people, but obviously it is quite in vogue, and it's it's a kind of specific way of training that's a bit different. And we've got James Poole with us to talk to us about it. So James, thanks for coming on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me on board.
No, great to have you on board. So I mean, maybe we should just jump into the Norwegian training method. So for the uninitiated, James, what do we mean when we say the Norwegian training method? It isn't just about eating large amounts of herring, is it?
No, wouldn't it be good though if it was? That was that easy. Yeah. That would be the silver bullet. Would be just eat pickled fish. No, I think it refers. I mean, obviously, it's come to the fore in recent years through athletes like the Ingebrigtsens who follow this sort of approach, but it can be quite complicated. So perhaps the most simplistic way is to look at sort of two ways: the standard way of training, which is carried out by most athletes, which is this sort of polarized training. So we're going to suggest 3 training zones. And so in the first is training zone 1, aerobic training, very easy. Sort of training you might do with your friends, breathe easily, you can think about things, it's low level training. And then I'm going to skip to 3, which is high intensity training. So it's the kind of training that is potentially quite unpleasant, but you do it in short amounts. So typically in a polarized training, you spend 80% of your time in zone 1, easy, and 20% of your time in zone 3, and almost no time in zone 2. And that's used by a lot of athletes to great success over many, many years.
Yeah.
What we're talking about with the Norwegian method is more of a pyramid style training. So you're going to spend, let's say, 70% of your time in zone 1, and maybe 15% in, or 70% in zone in we're just trying to get the maths correct, and 20% in 2 and 10% in 3. So
okay, yeah.
And that zone 2 is quite important because that's the difference between the two. And in zone 2, it's what they would call lactate threshold training. Thresholds training is in zone 2. And so that's what's been used successfully by a lot of the Norwegians. There's not the population of Norway and the Nordics is not very big, so a lot of these people are using it to a lot of success. So it suddenly comes to the fore as saying, is this the new way we should be training? Is that good? Is that a clear sort of?
I think so.
I think so. I'm a visual learner, so I've drawn a triangle with 3, 2, 1 in. So you're saying
a bit of a lopsided pyramid, to be fair.
The lopsided pyramid. So 2 is the most important. What is the most important? Where's the science here? What's the most important part, or are they all together?
The difference between the two is that you're spending in the Norwegian method. You spend some time in zone 2.
Right.
In the polarized method,
80-20.
You spend no time in zone 2.
Got
it's always just that we always talk about you've got to be fresh enough to go really hard. It's really hard or really easy, versus sometime really easy, sometime really hard, sometime in the middle.
Would you say that zone 2 is kind of race pace then? Is that the science? Is that why we should be in zone 2 more?
It depends obviously on the distance. So it's, and this is where it starts to get complicated. The Norwegian method, when you do it properly and by scientifically, is you work out where your lactate thresholds are. So this is why I don't want to jump to the end of the podcast, but this is why it probably doesn't work for a lot of people. It requires quite a lot of precision.
Yeah.
So you have to so again, we'll do a little bit of sports science, and I'm not a sports scientist, so I'm trying to make this, this is my understanding, and I'm happy to be proven wrong. But there's 2 parts with the lactate, with your threshold. Is LT1, lactate threshold 1, and lactate threshold 2. So what happens is when you do a lactate threshold test, you will do a series of intervals, usually at the track, and you will take a sample of blood, and that sample will measure the amount of lactate in your system. So up until lactate 1, when you're in this aerobic zone 1 phase, your body is producing lactate, which is a good thing, and it's processing it, and you're using it to energize yourself, to move forwards. At LT1, the effort is getting harder. So what happens in the intervals is they get faster. So when you get several intervals in, depends how fit you are, suddenly you'll get to LT1. And at LT1, lactate threshold 1, the amount of lactate your body is building is increasing at a faster rate than your body is able to process it. So that's arguably in what we might call a tempo run. And it's typically about a 40-minute effort, perhaps the sort of effort you would do for 40 minutes where you'd get to a point where you were done. So it's hard, but it's not super hard. Yeah, and this is what it gets complicated about these, and how you measure it is also hard. So you can do it with heart rate. If you do it with a lactate threshold machine, a lactate measurement, then you can be very precise. You can do it with heart rate. You can do it with perceived effort. Both of those methods are suboptimal because heart rate lags. Perceived effort is about perception, so it has some variation from individual to individual. And when you perceive effort for a workout session, you think about the whole effort rather than the individual bits, perhaps. So at LT2, your lactate level is got so big now that you cannot continue at the pace you were doing. So your intervals have increased. At LT2, it's the point when your legs are screaming and you can't. And for cycling, it's a little bit easier to do because you're turning the pedals. It gets to the point when you can no longer turn the pedals because the acidosis is built up in you, and we've all been there where your legs literally can't move. That's LT2. So what they do in this method is they work in that particular LT1 and LT2 space, because the idea is you train the body to be able to process lactic acid more efficiently.
As you say, James, it is quite technical, isn't it? And I guess my hope with the Norwegian method is that we could do some kind of, in simplest terms or broadly speaking, and I guess maybe that wouldn't be as accurate or as effective, but as you were sort of saying, we're talking about a bigger emphasis here, aren't we, on kind of tempo stroke threshold sessions, which is probably a kind of, roughly speaking, a 7 to 8 out of 10 effort. That's what this method's putting quite a lot of focus on. Running in that zone, isn't it? Yeah, it's
not VO2 max all out sprinting type stuff. It's definitely in that sustainably hard, comfortably uncomfortable sort of place. The sort of runs you do where you you sort of don't know whether you like or dislike that amount of effort. It's hard to just about do it. You'll know it when you're there, because it's like, oh, I don't think I can do this anymore, but you can do it a bit more, and then you can do it a bit more, and you sort of, and when you do it, you feel quite happy that, it's quite a satisfying feeling. It's in that space. The problem is that the Norwegian method really focuses at the bottom end of lactate threshold 1. And that's and so to understand where that is quite precise. And they do these lactate threshold tests. You can buy a machine. It's about £250. You have to buy, you obviously have to, it's invasive because you have to either prick the earlobe or the finger to get the small amount of blood. So it's probably out of the question for 99.9% of anyone who's listening to this, or anyone who, even if you like running a lot, it's kind of a fairly unpleasant thing to do. And so my concern about good and average, any runner who's doing this approach is that, are you in the right place?
Yeah.
And what does the bottom end of tempo look like, and what does it feel like, and what pace is that? And I think if you really committed to doing this and you really wanted to, then you could probably find that it would be somewhere close to a 45-minute run rather than a 40-minute run effort. But it's knowing how precise that is. And my worry would be, without knowing the precision, you fall into this trap of working in this sort of unproductive junk mode, where it's faster than it's more effort than you normally would do in zone 1, but it's not zone 3.
Yes.
And you're too tired to do zone 3 because you haven't got an energy, and perhaps you're then too tired to do the really easy zone 1 because you just need a day off for resting. So I'm not against it, but I think it's hard to be that precision with it. And I don't think, from the research that I read, there's a lot to suggest accurate ways of doing it without a lactate threshold monitoring tool.
Yeah, as someone with a severe phobia of needles, I'm instantly out. But is it an approach you would, from the sounds of things, no, but you wouldn't, this isn't an approach for the masses. You're talking about a very select few, like athletes, that would even do this.
Yeah.
Well, I think the masses want, without wishing to go off on a complete tangent, everyone's looking for a silver bullet. Everyone's looking for do less, a secret. And
£300 pair of shoes, right?
Yeah.
But people are looking for to train less and do well, and I get that, because everyone's time poor and everybody would like to be better than they are, but not really do the hard work. When you look deeply into both the polarized and the pyramidal approaches, what the underlying factor is that the athletes that do well on either approach are doing a lot of miles.
Yeah.
And as you had me on here before, and my belief is that to master something you need to spend a lot of time doing it. And I think to be a good runner, irrespective of distance, it is relative. So if you're doing a 5K, you don't have to do as many miles as a marathon, of course, but generally speaking, these athletes who follow either approach are served well by having big volume, either many years of running, or they're doing quite large amounts of mileage each week. Even if you look at someone like the Ingebrigtsens, they're doing 5 and 10,000 meter runners. They're running over 100 miles a week.
Whoosh.
Yeah, it's close to marathon training, isn't it? Really, that kind of mileage.
And using they're quite a good example, because if we're talking about, what did I say the number, 70, 20, 10, they're only doing, if you're doing 100 miles a week, you're only doing 10 miles in that top end, and you're only doing 20 miles in zone 2. So it's as a percentage, it's still, and even as an absolute number, it's still not that much work.
Yeah.
I think when you come down to it, if you're only doing 20 miles a week, the reality is then when you do the percentages, you're doing you're doing 4 miles in this tempo, and you're doing, so it's difficult to scale it back unless you're doing the bigger mileage.
This is the Runner's World podcast.
When the Norwegian method comes up, I guess the showcase session a week is this kind of double workout that's difficult, and it seems, to my sort of limited understanding, it's 2 hardish workouts in one day. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and the thinking behind that? Because it does seem quite excessive, that as an approach.
Yeah, I agree. And I want, again, I think it's one of these things where it's quite, I wonder how easy it is to regularly do those 2 sessions. So yes, you're absolutely right. Just to make that clear, part of the process is in that zone 2 space we've talked about, somewhere between LT1 and LT2 are these workouts. And what we'll do, 2 a day workouts in running are not uncommon. What you typically do is a hard one and an easy one in the same day.
Yeah.
Or you do 2 easy ones because you want to do more volume. What they suggest is 2 hard ones, but the harder sessions, zone 2 sessions, are quite short. The idea is you're training in between at the bottom end of LT1, in the back of that threshold zone, at the bottom of it, twice, so that your body is better at processing the lactic acid. It still comes down to better processing the lactic acid on a system that is more fatigued. I just feel like the number of people, the pool of the number of athletes doing it is quite small, and they've got huge years of training and volume behind them. It sort of sways it towards, and the research does suggest this, that some of these people, you might be the Norwegians who we're talking about, would do well on a polarized approach, because they have this incredible aerobic engine in there in the first place.
Do you think there's, yeah, I think it does. Do you think there are lessons though? Do you think, because obviously we're talking about the elite, the niche, the people doing 100 miles a week, which is mind blowing to me. What are the lessons someone like me doing my joy plan and taking it really easy? What can I learn from the Norwegians? And I guess the listener who's listening to this doing a park run, who's not that like elite, what's the kind of things we can take?
So what you could take away from it, I think this is where it starts to get a bit muddy, because you could easily find I think the polarized approach is better, because you know what really easy is, and you know what really hard is.
Yeah.
What we're asking is a perceived effort of, as Rick said, maybe 6.5, or between 6.5. Let's say LT1 is perceived effort of 6, and LT2, which is that where it suddenly becomes too high, is 8. You want to be you might be at the bottom end, more towards 6. But as we all know, with perceived effort, if you had a good night's sleep and a good day at work, and then sometimes runs feel harder or easier than other days. And so you're sort of potentially in this grey area, which maybe wrongly I'm calling it junk miles, but in this sort of zone where you're not really sure. And I think it's much easier to be, I'm running really easy or I'm running really hard. Those two, and again, those are perceived efforts, but you know what really hard is like. You know what really easy is. Why am I bothering doing this? It feels so easy. And really hard is, oh my God, when's this ever going to end? Those two things into that grey area, and because the Norwegian approach is very precise, it's hard to be precise without the precise tools to make it that way.
Yeah.
One quick thing is that if you think 100 miles for the Ingebrigtsens is scary, I'll send you the link, and if you want to include it in the notes, there is the papers that cover all this. They've just recently come out, and you can put them in. They're authored by lots of people, but they're very good. But there is in one of them the training program for Kipchoge in his build-up and obviously arguably the greatest long-distance runner in history. But he's running in the build-up phase 200 kilometers a week. So, and he's following a polarized approach, and he might do as little as 5K of his training week in that super hard space, and he's doing 80%. All of his training almost exclusively in this easy running. And if you look at it, some of it's 5-minute kilometers. I know I'm switching between kilometers and miles an hour. 8 miles an hour. That's 8-minute miles versus very, very fast. But it's a lot of it is like training runs that you and I could run along with Kipchoge and be happy.
Okay. So you're telling me to forget the joy plan and download Kipchoge's plan. I've heard it.
Yeah.
I've heard it.
If you can do a 200-kilometer week, I would be, kind of crazy, right? He does that.
I'll email you in a week and be like, James, I'm never running again.
I'm never listening again. But you have to sort of understand the body and how it works. The energy system, there's multiple energy systems. I'm not going to get deep into that as well. But some of those changes that happen to the body only happen when you run slowly.
Yeah.
And this is why often people forget that they think running slowly is a waste of time, and it's well proven that by running slowly your body adapts to, your aerobic system adapts. So all of these runners who are capable, whether you're doing the Norwegian method or you're doing a polarized approach, they spend a lot of time adapting their body so that they can earn the right to work really hard. And I'm intentionally using those words because you have to earn it, because they do strength and conditioning, and they do a lot of this work in this very slow space so that their bodies are strong enough and their systems can cope with running at that very, very hard level. For most of us, we don't do enough running to earn the very, very hard. So but we could spend more time working on that bit, I think. And it's not that we shouldn't, we can do it might be going from 1 hard session a week to 2. That's what we would earn by doing slower runs. And you only have to look at, there's so many of the elite athletes, and both those papers don't just have Kipchoge, they have the top 50. They're very good papers. They're very techie, they're very sciencey, but you only need to look at the list of the people who they've been working with to get the data, and it starts to really stand up to scrutiny that these people are putting. Whether you do either approach, there's a lot of time spent in the very easy zone one.
Yeah, James, what are you training like a Norwegian at the moment? What are you doing? I mean, you're recording from a car, so you're doing something cool.
So yeah, I'm very happy to be at the Trash Free Trails State of Our Trails Summit today, which is being held in actually quite nice weather in North Wales. They're an amazing organisation. People should check them out. It's a charity that's aiming to find solutions to the single-use pollution we find in the countryside on our trails for runners, riders, and roamers. And I know you've had them on the podcast before. You've had Rich. It's close to my heart. I've spent a lot of my time outside in the countryside, in London, in the parks and things, and nothing frustrates me more than to see the litter and the mess that gets left by people. And it's a big challenge, and part of it is to take that litter away and do the litter picking, but there's more people throwing it away than there are picking it up. So there's a whole piece of work we're doing today on changing education, changing people's perceptions, trying to stop them dropping it in the first place, but also at a brand level, how do you work with brands to be part of the solution? And they, all the manufacturers of the various drinks and energy bars and things that we use, how can we work with them to mean that we haven't got as much pollution on our trails, microplastics, etc., that make the place, 1, look awful, and 2, have much bigger consequences to our own lives, but also to the wildlife. So that's what I'm up to doing today. And it's good if people could check it out, get involved. There's do-it-yourself toolkits on there, so you can go out, and it's really easy to make a difference. Record the things that you're seeing, pick them up if you can. Take 1 bag out, even the smallest bag being taken off the trails is better than none, right? It doesn't need to be complicated.
Yeah. James, thanks so much for coming on the podcast talking about the Norwegian method. Always great to talk to you. I always feel like we get the truth from you. You don't sort of dress it up as like, the Norwegian method's amazing when potentially it is something very hard to follow. I'm glad you say that,
Rick. I always think that maybe I come on and I just poo-poo everyone's good ideas, and that isn't me at all. Because my sort of parting words would be, if you look back at all the runners who've been doing things over the years, if there was been a shortcut, if there'd been a Egyptian method, then everyone would be doing it, right? I mean, there are a few people doing some quirky things, but I think maybe that's unique to them and a number of athletes. But the tried and trusted does work, and I think is easier to follow than some of the I wouldn't necessarily call them silver bullets or magic potions, but they it's tough to do some of that stuff if you're just a regular everyday runner.
So that brings us to the end of this week's Runners World podcast. Big thanks to our guest James Poole, and to you, of course, for listening.